Several years ago, I was browsing through, of all things, a Marxist bookshop. I came across a volume entitled 10 of the Most Effective Revolutions That the World Has Seen. Can you imagine my utter astonishment when I discover that revolution number 5 in this volume, written by left-wing politicians, was a Christian revolution given the name of a Christian man that took place here in England. You'll be amazed and ask, who is it? Well, who is it that could own up to a personal debt between £500 and £600 at a time when his personal income was £30 per annum, which means that he was in debt to the tune of 20 years' salary, and yet he was undoubtedly the nation's greatest asset of his generation. Who is it who could, in pressing his revolution on the people of Britain, could be persecuted and brought to the point of death, and yet return to that same site sometimes less than 24 hours later and have those who had erstwhile persecuted him now become part of his revolution? Who is it who was intellectual enough to write 417 volumes, a commentary on the whole of the New Testament? One of those volumes was an edition of an English dictionary, as well as various school books, and yet be down to earth enough that the common people heard him gladly, and he would talk to them in their thousands as they gladly came to hear of his revolution. We're talking about John Wesley, revolutionary extraordinaire. John Wesley was undoubtedly one of the greatest Christian men since New Testament times and the likes of Peter and Paul. He was famous not only through his death and the legends that have grown up about him since, but in his own lifetime. Though he was much hated and persecuted in his earlier years, in his later years he was considered the very treasure, the darling of the British people, and was treated with such respect. He died quite near to here on the 2nd of March 1791, and even in days when the mass media was something of science fiction proportions, 10,000 people filed past his coffin. Such were the expectations of the crowds to his funeral that, according to his wishes, the funeral was as cheaply run as possible, and he was buried before daylight to avoid the masses and the uncontrollable crowds which the authorities were expecting. This is Wesley's chapel, and this is the statue of Wesley himself commemorating the great man.
Almost from his birth, he was trained by his mother to be methodical. She was terribly disciplined, as you know. Used to have lessons for the children in the rectory, and as you yourself have told me, got him to learn the alphabet in one day, and they weren't allowed to cry unless they cried quietly. You know, the whole house was a kind of strict elementary school. So you might say he sucked in Methodism, you might say, with his mother's milk. She was terribly methodical. She had 19 kids. They didn't all survive, so with 19 kids and practically no money. Remember, her husband was in prison for debt and wasn't popular with the locals at all, so everything rested upon her shoulders. And it was for those reasons that his mother organized the rectory in a methodical way. His debt to her was overwhelming.
John Wesley was born in June 1703 to Samuel and Susanna Wesley. Samuel was the vicar in Epworth in Lincolnshire, northern England. He was the 15th child born to this couple, but at the time of John's birth he only had 5 living sisters and 1 brother. The mortality rate of children in those days was absolutely astronomical. The living brother, by the way, was not Charles Wesley. He was born 4 years later.
John's debt to his brother was beyond calculation, the hymns, after all. I always say Charles wrote the hymns, but John lived them. Charles, as you know, disagreed with almost everything John did here at Wesley Chapel. Charles was very much more one of the establishment. He married a wealthy woman, you know, and lived comfortably in a nice house at Marylebone. When he was dying, he said, I don't want to be buried in my brother's unconsecrated graveyard. I want to be buried as befits an Anglican parson in episcopally consecrated ground, much to John's distress. See, John was outside that kind of rigid ecclesiasticism altogether. And John was very distressed because he felt they should share the tomb as they shared their life. And so the whole situation for Charles was very different from John's.
The story is graphically told by Wesley as well as others of his generation, how at the age of 5½, Wesley faced death and yet stayed calm and serene through it. The reason for this was really his own father. Samuel Wesley was rather a rough man and used to put the claims of Christianity very roughly upon the local populace. He wasn't very popular at all. And what would happen from time to time, he would find that his cattle were stabbed, his crops were burnt, his barn fell down once, his flax was destroyed, and things like this would happen quite regularly. When John Wesley, known as Jackie to the family, was 5½, the local populace, in their rebellion against Samuel Wesley's very hard approach, set fire to the rectory where the family and the servants lived. The fire very quickly spread, for it had a thatched roof, and as the alarm was made, the family and the servants gathered together, picked up the babies and ran out into the garden. And it was with horror, as they arrived in the garden, they discovered that little Jackie hadn't even woken up as far as they knew and was still in the blazing inferno. Susanna dropped to her knees very fervently praying while Samuel was trying to create some access to the building to go and save what was probably his favourite son. He couldn't do it. Doors were collapsing, ceilings were falling in. There was no entrance to the building. He was pleasantly surprised as he looked up, and on the story above the ground floor he could see his 5-year-old son pushing a chest towards the window so that he could stand on it and ease his way to the windowsill. There wasn't enough time to rush away for a ladder, so one of the crowd stood on the shoulders of the man in front of him, picked up the child, and so John Wesley was saved from death at the age of 5½. 40 years later, and Wesley was preaching, he remembered one night in the middle of a prayer meeting with a vast congregation, he remembered that it was the exact 40 years anniversary of this being rescued from this fire. And he announced it to the congregation, and he puts in his diary that the meeting went on into the early hours while people were giving thanks very warmly that God had seen fit to save this man who was at that point of time saving Britain from something very terrible.
We had a comfortable watch night at the chapel. About 11 o'clock it came into my mind that this was the very day and hour in which 40 years ago I was taken out of the flames. I stopped and gave a short account of what wonderful providence. The voice of praise and thanksgiving went up on high, and great was our rejoicing before the Lord.
It wasn't only Samuel Wesley's approach to Christianity that upset the local populace. It was his own political views. He had fierce Tory convictions, as well as his view of the church, for in those days there was a movement within the church wanting the whole thing to be reformed. Samuel was a high churchman, which meant in simple terms that he would press the ceremony of Christianity, and that was common in the Church of England, and it wasn't very relevant to the people. The people of Epworth didn't like it very much. But his convictions politically and his involvement in the Church of England meant that quite often he would be on trips to London, which was 120 miles away, and while he was away he would go on horseback, which would mean a day or two to get to London, time of course to come back, and sometimes his stays in London were for several months. It was during one of these prolonged visits to London that Susanna started something which, to my own understanding, very strongly affected John Wesley in his mature years. The attendance at the local church was very sparse, 20, 25 people, at Samuel Wesley's own words. But while he was away, Susanna started something very innovative. She began meeting in the home and inviting the local population to come and meet with her. This grew out of the family devotional time that they used to have every Sunday night at the rectory at Epworth. First of all, there was 20, 25 people joining them, and what would happen was that Susanna would read a prayer, read a sermon, and then talk with the people about their needs, their worries and their concerns. Within a matter of weeks, there was 200 people meeting at the rectory Sunday nights after church. She wrote to her husband explaining what was happening, expecting, I'm sure, his full approval and excited response to the wonderful thing that was happening. He wrote back bitterly, complaining. And there are two classic letters wonderfully preserved for us that reveal something of Susanna's wonderful character. Dated the 6th of February in 1712 and the 25th of February 1712, in clear handwriting, Susanna wrote these letters to her husband. These letters are important because they reveal the heart of the woman who was the strongest influence on John Wesley. All her actions, her motivations were affecting this man for his lifelong calling, which of course at this time he had no sense of. But these letters are so vivid and so graphic in their presentation of who and what Susanna Wesley was.
This one thing has brought more people to church than ever anything did in so short a time. We used not to have above 20 or 25 at evening service, whereas now we have between 200 and 300. Besides the constant attendance on the public worship of God, our meeting has wonderfully conciliated the minds of this people towards us, so that we now live in the greatest amity imaginable. And what is still better, they are very much reformed in their behaviour on the Lord's Day. And those who used to be playing in the streets now come to hear a good sermon read, which is surely more acceptable to Almighty God. Another reason for what I do is that I have no other way of conversing with this people, and therefore have no other way of doing them good. But by this I have an opportunity of exercising the greatest and most noblest charity, that is, charity to their souls.
And if that letter doesn't reveal something of the warmth, then listen to what the second one says as she wrote to her husband, who was strongly against these meetings.
I need not tell you the consequences if you determine to put an end to our meeting. I can now keep the people to the church, but if it be laid aside, I doubt that they will ever go to hear Inmanmore, at least those who come from the lower end of town. If you do, after all, think fit to dissolve this assembly, do not tell me that you desire me to do it, for that will not satisfy my conscience. But send me your positive command in such full and express terms as may absolve me from all guilt and punishment for neglecting this opportunity of doing good, when you and I shall appear before the great and awful tribunal of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Unfortunately, Samuel did not have the innovation or the creativity to see beyond what was happening in the hearts and minds of the people. As far as we understand, those meetings continued until Samuel returned from London. The stubbornness of Samuel Wesley must be related. In fact, all these accounts I'm relating to you because of the obvious connection between John Wesley's later character and his approach to his revolution and the context in which he was brought up. I talk of Samuel Wesley being stubborn inasmuch as he stayed in the midst of this awful persecution from the local population. Not only did they burn his rectory down, not only did they stab his cattle, burn his flax, knock down his barn, but their interference with certain local intrigue against his income, which was obviously dependent on the crops, put him in debt, and in June 1705 he was put into the debtor's prison. 1705, that would mean that John Wesley was only 2-3 years old, and father was in prison for 6 or 7 months because of a debt. We're not sure of how it was paid, but paid it was, and Samuel Wesley was let out of prison just before 1705 passed. And his resoluteness, his determination to stay and fight on in the midst of these incredible odds must have had a very profound effect on the young John as he developed. After some intense educational efforts put upon John and Charles by mother and father, especially the mother, at the age of 10, John Wesley went to Charterhouse School in London. This is it, folks. If I was really emulating John Wesley, I would be getting out of my bed at 5 o'clock every morning and running round here several times before breakfast. They do say that the early years are the formative years, and John Wesley's first departure from home was at the age of 10, and he came here. Today this is the green outside the Medical College of St. Bart's Hospital. It's changed hands several times through the years. Merchant Taylors had a building on the other side of the green, but in Wesley's day the whole surround belonged to Charterhouse School. Wesley was here quite free of charge. The Duke of Buckingham, one of the Board of Governors no less, had put him forward for a scholarship, and so he was a highly honoured scholar. He was put down by many of the other scholars whose parents were paying their fees. He does say that his 6 years here, from the ages of 10 through to 16, were 6 of the hardest years of his life, for the older students were always putting on him. He says in his journal that he rarely ate potatoes while he was here, as the older students always stole those potatoes. In fact, anything that was really good and nourishing was taken off him. But he claimed in later years that it didn't hinder his health at all. In fact, he claimed that it was one of the reasons why he was so healthy. It's still a green today. They reckon that in 1348, the outbreak of bubonic plague that hit London and ravaged the population, that most of the bodies, up to 50,000, are actually buried underneath where I'm standing. And so for 6 years, every morning, it said he would rise and run round this green 5 times. Oh well, let's keep up with a great man. In my case, it's 20 years later than in Wesley's, but here we go.
If there hadn't been some special arrangement, he couldn't have gone there because they had no money. You might almost call him a scholarship boy, might you not? Yes, he was absolutely dedicated to his education, partly because of his mother's influence and partly because of his own temperament. He never did things by halves.
At the age of 16, he considered himself ready to go to university. And at those days, someone who was applying for a place at university needed a sponsor, someone to write a letter of support, somebody to speak up for them. There was a very famous man, a Christian man in the Church of England in London by the name of Dr. Henry Sacheverell. He was a very tall man, and at this point of time, at 16, Wesley wasn't very tall at all. In fact, it said that he was only 5'5" when he stood to his full height. So at 16, he was even less than this, and he recounts in his diary that he felt like David facing Goliath. Unfortunately, with this story, David wasn't as successful as the biblical counterpart. For in suggesting to Dr. Sacheverell that he was ready for university, the tall man looked down upon him and said, "Young man, you are far too young to know Greek or Latin," which is rather a ridiculous statement, as by this time John Wesley was quite expert. He'd learnt New Testament Greek in his own home, in his childhood, from his mother. But Sacheverell, obviously judging everybody by his own standards, refused to give John any support. However, 12 months later, John arrived at Christ Church College, Oxford. John was amazed at the lacks in morality and the whole attitude to life that was prevalent in his day. Well, not only were the tutors and the professors enjoying a life of luxury and ease, but the students were doing likewise. John could not understand this, and although he was as active in sports as he was academically, applied himself very strictly to his studies at hand. He set himself quite high goals and aimed for them, and most of them he achieved. He had some radical views which were picked up while at Oxford about medicine and cures. He says himself that at one point of time, having a nosebleed, he stripped naked with his contemporaries, stood on the side of the Thames and dived into the river, swam around for 10 minutes, believing that the cold swim would stop his nosebleed. What he didn't tell us in his diary is whether or not it was effective. I wonder what would happen in the 20th century if it was discovered that that is the cure for nosebleeds. And what were the influences that caused him to become ordained as an Anglican minister?
Well, his father was an Anglican parson, as you know, and his grandparents had both been parsons, and he was so religious that he took it almost as a matter of course to become a parson.
Terrible, awful apathy of society was reflected in the ministry of the church. The whole rank and file of Church of England ministers had a reputation for being so lax in their morals, in their lifestyle. In fact, many people wanted to enter the ministry who wanted to become poets or painters because it was such an easy life. And this movement began within the Church of England and sometimes out of it, but basically in Britain it was in the context of the Church of England that these classes, these groups, these societies as they were called in Wesley's time, sprang up everywhere. The Methodist societies, as they came to be known later, were not a unique thing in as much as societies were very, very common. It was the attempt of individuals who were moving in God, who had come to know God in a very strong way, wanting to bring this new life that came from God himself into the church. And the Church of England were allowing this thing to happen as long as it didn't encroach on the mainstream flow of how the Anglican setup was going at this time. Leaving of Oxford and the move ultimately to Georgia, how did that come about?
Well, it was all part of this dedication to religious practice. I mean, he just felt he got to do these things as a Christian. Even though his Christian experience was to some degree, as he would have said later on, limited, it was just, he was taking religion seriously. And people who take religion seriously, of course, are sometimes a curse, aren't they? You've got to look at the history of Europe to see that. But he was taking religion very seriously, and that meant spreading the gospel among the heathen Red Indians. And he went to America wanting to share his religion with the Red Indians, but because he hardly ever got to them, he was surrounded by the white settlers. And they couldn't stand his seriousness. You know, he was so utterly, without any sense of humor, you might say, dedicated to religious practice. These colonists just couldn't take it. And then, as you know, he fell in love. He always liked women's company, and he fell in love with a girl. She put off marrying him and married one of the settlers. And it upset Wesley tremendously, and he wouldn't receive her communion because he felt she'd gone back on her words to him and the agreement between them. And so, of course, he had to run for his life. You know that, don't you? I mean, you know what the settlers were like? They were a pretty rough lot. And then here was this posh, pucker, strict young parson preventing one of the girls whose father was one of the leading colonists going to communion. So he just had to, as I say, run for his life. You know that, don't you? I mean, when he came back to England eventually, he was utterly broken-hearted and despairing. Religion hadn't got him anywhere at all. I mean, he'd been terribly religious, but hadn't got him anywhere at all. Hadn't brought him joy or peace or success. So he was ready to be converted, wasn't he? And of course, that's the interesting thing. The idea that an Anglican parson needed conversion wasn't on. And here he was, upper class in a sense, erudite, virtuous, too good to be true. And the idea that such a man needed a conversion experience was just not acceptable.
John Wesley was back home in England, depressed and deflated. He had gone to Georgia with the main thought in his mind of preaching to the Indians, which opportunity never came about. He had gone there at the insistence of Oglethorpe to be the pastor, the vicar, the minister to all the settlers who were there in Georgia, and yet he'd made such a mess of it in his own opinion that he didn't feel capable of really returning to the site. On top of that, his talks with Spangenberg and his experience of the Moravian people who he saw very close to on the ship sailing to America left him with this aching void. He knew there was something in Christian experience that was beyond him. He knew that there was something of Christianity, even though he was steeped in Bible, he was steeped in the traditions of the church, there was something that he'd missed out, and he was hungering for it. In our next program, I'll explain to you how this experience came to him and how that experience changed Britain and the world. The impact that John Wesley made on his generation, and indeed in succeeding generations, is still being assessed today. He had a profound religious effect, of course, a profound political effect, a profound social effect on the whole of Britain. In our last programme, we had a cursory glimpse of those influences which moulded this man who was to shape the future of Britain for many years. We looked at his home and the loving yet very strict upbringing that Susanna Wesley imposed upon him. We discussed the isolation of the Wesley family in Epworth, which meant that there were no outside influences encroaching in the home. Indeed, the only time when Wesley was in his childhood away from Susanna's influence was after the fire that we refer to, when the whole of the Wesley family was farmed out, as it were, to people who lived nearby. And Susanna complained bitterly that when the new rectory was built and the family returned home, her children had gone wild. but her standards of what was wild and present day standards, I'm sure, is something quite different. And so the Wesley Revolution was ready to start, known as the Methodist Revival, the Evangelical Awakening of Britain. It was to begin with this man. He'd returned from America in almost a state of depression. He was a very logical, thinking man who approached life asking questions about God, and because of his upbringing, of course, was constantly relating the questions of life to the Bible and to God himself. 4 crises happened in the next 4 or 5 years, which were to cause Wesley to break out like a butterfly out of a cocoon. The whole seed planting influences of his character were to suddenly blossom over 4 years, and it's these crises which caused the blossoming to come. The first crisis was this terrible sense of failure. He'd gone to America with this thought that he could achieve something, he had something to give, and yet came home with the feeling in the pit of his bones that somehow he had missed out what Christianity was. He put in his journal that a very sorrowful line that he went to convert the Indians, he wrote, but oh, who will convert me?
Of course, that's the interesting thing. The idea that an Anglican parson needed conversion wasn't on. And here he was, upper class in a sense, erudite, virtuous, too good to be true. And the idea that such a man needed a conversion experience was just not acceptable. So he came home thoroughly depressed, and that led him, of course, towards the conversion experience. Anglicanism and religion and religiosity hadn't really got him anywhere at all, just as it doesn't get the church anywhere at all, does it? I mean, you need this dedication, this experience of Christ's love. And that, of course, came to him through the conversion experience.
He met a man called Spangenberg, we referred to in our last program, and on his return to England, on the second day after his return, he met a man who was to be one of the most influential, most powerful characters in the next few years, a German man called Peter Böhler. Peter Böhler was one of the Moravian Christians. The Moravian movement was started by a gentleman by the name of Count von Zinzendorf, and it was an evangelical movement which emphasized more of the contemplative aspects of Christianity more than the evangelical side, which is what John Wesley obviously reverted to at his conversion.
When he was in this misery, feeling that religion hadn't got him anywhere and he'd mucked it all up, the Moravians came just at that critical moment and began to give him a taste of a religion that wasn't so, how shall we put it, wasn't so formal and conventional, and wasn't just what the religion of a parson, but of somebody whose whole life was centered in Jesus. That's what he got from them, and they came just at the right moment.
So Wesley was back in London in February 1738. He took up lodgings with a Mr. James Hutton, On the 24th of May of that same year, he got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, he did his normal reading and devotions, and then went to St. Paul's Cathedral behind me, that you can see. He went to St. Paul's for evensong. He makes several notes about the service at St. Paul's, and then he was invited to a society meeting down here on Aldersgate Street in the City of London. It was, of course, radically different than what you see here and now, but he must have taken this very walk which I am doing right now. He came down to this meeting and sat there, arrived there sometime after 8, and he actually notes the time in his diary as being 9:15 that evening, when something very important happened. As he came into the meeting, they were reading from the preface of Martin Luther's commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans. And while the gentleman was reading, whoever he was convening the meeting, John Wesley sat there meditating on what he was hearing, and his own words tell the account in his diary of what happened.
Let him that cannot receive it ask the Father of lights that he will give more light, both to him and me. I think it was about 5 this morning that I opened my testament on those words. There are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, even that ye should be partakers of the divine nature. Just as I went out, I opened it again on those words, Thou art not far from the kingdom of God. In the afternoon I went to St. Paul's. The anthem was, Out of the deep have I called unto thee, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. O let thine ears consider well the voice of my complaint. If thou, O Lord, will be extreme to mark what is done amiss, O Lord, who may abide it? But there is mercy with thee, therefore thou shalt be feared. O Israel, trust in the Lord, for with the Lord there is mercy, and with him is plenteous redemption, and he shall redeem Israel from all her sins. In the evening I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street, where one was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death.
Well, I think Wesley would probably turn in his grave to know what the site is like today, but this is where it all happened. This same man, Peter Bowler, brought about a society meeting which came to be known as the Fetter Lane Society, even though originally it started somewhere down near Drury Lane. And John Wesley took the lead of this society. The aims of the society were more for personal holiness and seeking after God. George Whitefield did join them at times, and the fellowship there was rich. Things happened which have their contemporary events in 20th century Christianity, which we'll talk about a little later. And so these two first crises of John Wesley's experience, first of all his sense of failure as he returned from America in February 1738, this conversion experience, as we'll call it, on the 24th of May, and a little bit later we jump to this crisis which seems trivial to us in the 20th century, but to John Wesley one of the major hurdles he had to cross was his invite by George Whitefield.
They didn't agree, as you know, but they never fell out. John knew his debt. He knew his debt to Whitefield was overwhelming, and the two men loved each other, but they held completely different views. As you know, Whitefield was a Calvinist, and much more conformed to this world than John was. And one reason why Whitefield moved his church from here, it was near the Foundry, over to the West End. It's now the American Church in Tottenham Court Road, was so that they didn't tread on one another's toes. There was a very mutual affection and respect between them, despite their fundamental differences doctrinally.
George Whitefield was a friend of John Wesley's, who came into Wesley's life round about the end of the Holy Club, just as John and his brother were going to America, and then the Holy Club dispersed. Whitefield also had a conversion experience and very quickly developed into one of the most amazing preachers and public orators that this nation, if not the world, has ever seen. He put so much into his public oratory, which was probably one of the basic reasons why he became old before his time. Garrick, the famous actor of that generation, is on record as having said that he would have given 100 guineas if only he could say the word "oh" in public the way George Whitefield did, for it had such an effect on the masses that he was preaching to that it changed their lives. Another contemporary writer who was by no means sympathetic to the cause of George Whitefield is on record as having said that when he used the word Mesopotamia in the context of some sermon or other, it had such an amazing effect. It brought tears to the eyes of the people and swept them into the kingdom of God. Whitefield was preaching to crowds of 20 and 30,000, and is even said to have preached to 80,000 on Kennington Common, and even the people on the periphery of such a vast sea of human beings could hear his voice quite clearly. On record it is said that he would stride up and down with such a loud theatrical manner that it was difficult not to stop and listen to him for the whole length of his address, which was often 1 and 2 hours at a time. And so George Whitefield, preaching in the open air in Bristol, invited John Wesley to come to him. Now the word outdoor is the word that affected Wesley. He had thought it almost a sin against God to think that anyone could even be saved or brought to Christianity who was not in a church building. Such was his high church leanings and the influence of his upbringing. And Whitefield invited him to Bristol just to see what he thought of the whole setup. When Wesley arrived there, he was amazed, number one, at the size of the crowd that Whitefield was addressing, and then at this amazing experience as he listened to Whitefield explain scripture to these masses. And we're not talking of church people. It's very difficult in the 20th century for us to understand what society was like in the early 1700s. They were referred to by many commentators as wild animals, especially the colliers of Bristol, which were termed as lowest of the low by many. For instance, some of the stories that are told of things that happened in Bristol at that time were things like grudges. There was murder, was ever so common, thieving, brawling, and such was the atrocities committed in that society in their godless state. The story was brandished on the front pages of newspapers across the nation when one certain gang held such a grudge against this chap that even when the man had died, they dug up the body to cut the body up and do all sorts of terrible things. They were so animalistic, and it was this sort of person in their thousands who were gathering on the fields outside Bristol that George Whitefield was addressing. And the conversion experiences were so real that immediately the very society of Bristol was changed instantly, even though the upper class, the gentleman's magazine of the age, was quoted as with derisive remarks of George Whitefield taking these people from their work. They said, when the inferior people are taken from the work, it is surely to be the downfall of any society, or when production cannot take place. However, Wesley, once he'd recovered from the shock of seeing Whitefield preach in public, had a double shot come to him when Whitefield announced he was going to America, and would Wesley kindly stand in for him preaching to these masses while he was away. This was a crisis indeed for John Wesley, for not only was it to him a heinous sin to be preaching anywhere but within the four walls of a church, crisis gravely bearing upon him, but also what to do with these people. For what was going through Whitefield's mind was quite different from Wesley's concepts of things. Whitefield was an evangelist at heart and could only envisage bringing these people to a conversion experience in Jesus Christ. Whereas John Wesley was immediately thinking of taking these masses somehow indoors and organising them into groups so that there would not be a low in their minds following the high rise of a great revival atmosphere that accompanied George Whitefield. Once this crisis was crossed by John Wesley, he often preached in graveyards such as this. When arriving at churches, the vicars, the ministers would not allow him to preach inside. He would then stand on some of these raised gravestones and graves and preach. And more often than not, the crowd outside was vastly superior in numbers to what was within the four walls. So now John Wesley had encountered and come through victorious over his third crisis. The fourth crisis to which we're referring was something that had happened earlier in his life with the Holy Club at Oxford and was now happening with the Fetter Lane Society that he was the leader of.
The Holy Club was a gathering of friends with a mutual interest of increasing personal knowledge of Christianity. They would gather most nights of the week to read the New Testament together. John Wesley took a firm hold of the leadership, and it was while this group was a major factor in Wesley's life that he met a man called George Whitefield, who was residing in Oxford at that time. Whitefield became a regular member of the group, the name of which, incidentally, was given by the derisory remarks of the rest of the student body, amongst several others, such as Bible moths, enthusiasts, and for the first time Methodists was used. The Fetter Lane Society started down near Drury Lane by Peter Buller, who had a very strong influence on John earlier.
And while Wesley was away, such was the dynamic class of his leadership and the quality of his decision-making that the things that he was directly involved in tended to drop somewhat in his absence, for there was nobody who could compete with the quality of this man. What was happening was, as he was setting up classes in Bristol, the Fetter Lane Society was his major contribution to the Christian life in London. But while he was throwing himself into the work at Bristol, preaching 3 and 4 times a day, busily trying to set up the classes around that area, the Fetter Lane Society was sadly dissipating.
They put a lot of emphasis upon doctrine and having the right doctrines, and Wesley didn't want just to be involved in doctrinal controversy. And he left them and he left Fetter Lane and established his own much more basically nonconformist society. See, in Germany, the Moravians were dominated by Count von Zinzendorf, you know, and they kind of bowed before him. That wasn't Wesley's world at all. He was quite outside the social system, the class system. He said, I don't want to meet a rich Methodist.
And in the year 1716, the local nobility were invited, and a man from Switzerland was brought in by the name of Andrew Schalk, very experienced engineer, and they were to show off guns recently taken from the French, and they were to be recast right here at the foundry. While Andrew Schalk was overseeing, he mentioned to the foundry supervisor that there was water in the molds and that it was a very dangerous thing to put molten metal where there was water. They very hastily withdrew. However, the casting went on, and there was an incredible explosion which killed and maimed many of those that were present. It was a terrible thing. There was holes in the roof. The building was virtually destroyed. That was 1716, when Wesley was in his last year here at Charterhouse studying in London, the last year before he went to Oxford. In late 1739, early 1740, when Methodism was beginning to take a hold, the revival was just beginning. Here in London there were 40 to 50 people who came to Wesley and specifically asked him to take care of their souls, to become their spiritual head, their pastor. He realized that a headquarters, an office, was needed. And looking around London, he finished up here on Windmill Street, now Tabernacle Street, at the Foundry. He purchased the ruins and renovated the whole place. There was a meeting hall with about 1,500 people could be seated. There was a classroom at the back where his 5 o'clock in the morning meetings took place, as well as the classes. There was a bookshop where all Wesley's publications were sold. There was a little medical centre, as well as Wesley's own home and site, where he brought his mother down from Epworth, who spent her last 3 years living at the Foundry. She died in 1742 here at the Foundry, and she's buried not far from here at Bunhill Fields. So Methodism had its first home, and it became the very centre, the hub from where it all happened for well over 30 years.
It wasn't just religiosity. Fundamentally, of course, it was preaching about Jesus as our Saviour, and the only possibility of real life is through faith in him. But it wasn't just religiosity. For example, he started, there was mission preaching, of course, and class meetings, and the Sunday school, and the day school. I mean, most parsons didn't think the workers needed day schools. Their job was just do what they were told, you see. And he founded the first free clinic and dispensary in England. There was no National Health Service then. And if Maggie has a way, there won't be one when I die. But he founded this there, and we've still got in the house, when you get there, one of the most extraordinary objects to find in a saint's house is his electrical machine, as well as his Bible. And he used to use that to give electric shocks to people suffering from nervous disorders, which is the modern technique, as you know. And once he said, for the last 23 years, the chief object of my reading in my spare time has been medicine and health. He was interested in the whole man, you know, the whole, not just the soul, but the body too. So the Foundry was a wonderfully all-embracing Christian setup. The almshouse for poor old people who don't know where to go, a loan club to help people, that sounds modern, doesn't it? To help people set up in some little business. And
this break with the Fetter Lane Society was a grief to John Wesley's heart. He refers to it several times in the journal, and it was obviously very upsetting to him. However, taking an aerial view of his life and what happened round about these circumstances, it was obviously very beneficial for the cause of the revolution what happened here. For up to now, apart from the fact that he was talking to thousands of people in Bristol, in London it had been quite a parochial sort of affair with this group. But because of the breakup of the Fetter Lane group, he was now forced to preach in the streets. And it could be argued quite reasonably that it was because of the breakup of this group that he went out using the philosophy which was epitomised in his statement that the world was his parish. In fact, the whole of the United Kingdom became his parish. And so, with an overview of the situation thus far in John Wesley's life, the seeds that were planted in his childhood and his youth, his attitude to Christianity, his attitude to the Bible, his attitude towards people, his attitude towards the cause cause of winning people for Christ, these seeds that had been in him from his very earliest years now came into full blossom. And for the next 52 years, John Wesley was in top gear, changing the face of Britain and indeed impacting the whole of the world with the Wesleyan Revolution. The motor of the Wesleyan Revolution was now in action and ready to roll. In our first two programs we have seen firstly how the upbringing and the circumstances of John Wesley's childhood built into him certain features that had an attitude to work, to study and to reaching people for Christ. In our second program we looked at those 4 crises which were major hurdles for John Wesley to jump across before this revolution could really get in full swing. There was this depression of his failure in America. There was that amazing conversion experience at Aldersgate Street. Then there was this confrontation with outdoor preaching, which was to become the very highlight of his the next 52 years of his life. And finally there was the breakup of the Fetter Lane group, which set him out amongst the people. The Wesleyan Revolution was here, and John Wesley, the leading revolutionary extraordinaire, was now in top gear. Christian history, indeed Western civilization's history, is dotted with these accounts of so-called Christian revivals, awakenings. What happened in Wesley's day, it was very long-lasting. It took 4, 5 generations for the initial impact to wear off. And as many of these so-called revivals have been dissipated over 24, 36 months, and then the following years people have forgotten all about it, apart from the history books. What happened in Wesley's case was so vivid and so impacting to that society that it has been well documented and assessed as the centuries have gone by. I would like to suggest that to separate what Wesley taught from what he practiced is quite a silly thing to do. And that what was happening during these 52 years, the emphases he was making, the practices which he tried to make the norm, were the very things which made this spiritual awakening so long-lasting. It is almost a joke in the 20th century as to what the sermon can do. Folks refer to sermons in the most derisive manner. And it's usually a put down to say that, oh yes, it's good preaching that starts revivals. John Wesley was indeed a magnificent preacher, preaching over 40,000 times throughout his 52-year Methodist crusade. 40,000 times, which is quite an amazing number. And his sermons, very profound and very life-changing though they were, was really the tip of the iceberg, as it should be in any society where Christianity is to make an impact. Christianity dominated 1700 through to 1800, the society and the impact that John Wesley left. And it was because not only of his preaching, but of these practices that he introduced as a lifestyle, not only in church, but what was happening outside of church. Not only in the meetings, but what happened when people got home with their wives and their children. And some of these things are very relevant. In the 20th century, in this late 20th century, there is acknowledged to be a move of God. Something is happening in Christian circles that is being acknowledged as new, as revolutionary. It's been given many titles, the Restoration Movement, the House Church Movement, this new breath of God. For instance, in his diary, around about 1739, he remarks how that the small group was the place where people would find spiritual stability, but also relationship stability. John Wesley noticed how lonely many people were, and how that by forming long-term, stable friendships in the context of a small group that met regularly was a very healthy thing to do. And what also is not commonly known, but is there plain for all to see in his journals, that out of these cells, these small classes, he created what he called a band, which is something similar to the prayer cells that are commonly springing up today, where 2 or 3 people would be meeting together for a deeper sort of relationship, where they would confess their faults, their sins, pray for each other, counsel each other. And John Wesley himself promulgated these things in the Wesleyan Great Awakening. It's a parallel to the house church in this 20th century, who in their emphasis on relationships have this similar ethos that looks towards people creating long-term stable relationships. It's often looked at as a 20th century innovation of the house church, but it was obviously an 18th century creation by John Wesley himself. Aggressive evangelism. Of course, John Wesley's lifestyle was nothing but evangelism. It's almost humorous to the normal evangelical Christian to read it in his diary, where he gives the account, and he says that as an experiment, he said he would wait for some divine leading, some divine inspiration, some touch of God upon his heart before he would talk to people about Jesus Christ. Just as an experiment, he thought he would try it. And for 2 days, he spoke to nobody about Christ. He didn't preach, perhaps the only 2 days of his entire life where he got into such conduct. He tried to just be sociable and leave God out of things, but couldn't do it. And so he was aggressively evangelistic, realizing that what he had was not just a religious experience in the narrow confines of common 20th century understanding, but something, an experience, a relationship that could change lives, and could change work, and could change families. And in this presentation, it burned in his heart all the more to reach the entire nation and tell them this news about this faith, this instantaneous conversion experience which he had so wonderfully gone through. He wanted others to enjoy the same. It was a similar thing in Wesley's day when he remarked in his journal in 1738 about things which was indeed a lifelong practice for John and his brother Charles. It was the writing of Christian songs and hymns, which of course in the 20th century are now referred to as classics, doctrinal, beautiful songs, many of them sung right across the world in all denominations. It's very interesting to note that this generation is the first generation since the Wesleys which has such an outbreak of Christian hymn and song writers writing songs for congregational singing, which is breathing new life into Christian congregations right across the nation of Britain, indeed affecting the whole world. Love feasts. The love feast that Wesley introduced in the context of the Methodist revival wasn't a passing round of a little piece of bread and a little glass of wine while they pray, but it was a very wonderful expression of gathering together of people of like heart and mind who would eat together, who would share together, and would really enjoy each other's company. And they would discuss things while enjoying their love feast, and not just have a so-called church meeting. There were other things he emphasized into jobs. He was very concerned about the unemployed in his church, and commented in 1777, when he was quite an old man, that at the beginning of his revival he used to make notes, and he noted that 1 in 3 of the people who joined his Methodist revolution were unemployed. But in 1777 that number had dropped to 1 in 10, which is a remarkable observation, that where evangelical Christianity makes inroads into a society, the standard of living goes up, people's attitude to work becomes a different matter, and so the whole of society is benefited. He was into women preachers, women leaders, harangued and harassed by many quarters. He had women preachers. He appointed ladies as class leaders, which is a burning issue here in the late 20th century. And in many corners of this new thing that is happening in the 20th century, women are also coming to the forefront of the public image. They're preaching, leading churches and meetings. Women are being released and taken away from the old the chains of traditional concepts, which are really without foundation in the Bible. Medicine. John Wesley was into medicine in a big way. He put lots of his money into buying medicine and keeping the poor stocked with supplies that could help them in their sicknesses. He had some strange ideas. Alternative medicine, we'd probably call it. Electricity had just been discovered, as it were, in his generation, and John Wesley invented an electric machine. He used to invite people who were suffering from various illnesses, and what he used to call electrify them, which meant that he would give them a shock. Now, obviously, at that state of development, no one quite knew how much and how strong the shock was, but he would electrify people, and commonly testified in his diary that when he would bring Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so to be electrified, having electrified them, their sickness left. And leaves a few question marks perhaps over that conduct, but he was open enough to see that there was something beyond the plain, straightforward concepts of Christianity, that we have a church meeting, we sing a few hymns, we have a sermon preached, and then we all go home. This was an all-round thing to get into to the lifestyle, into the warp and woof of a society, so that these influences would have very strong, lasting effects. He was into Christian education. And again, in this 20th century, we have this awakening of Christian schools, this concept of Christian education, which is beginning to bite and have a profound impact not only in Britain but in other nations of the world. Whereas 25 years ago a Christian school was a very strange thing, now there are literally thousands of Christian schools opening all around the world. He got couples together and preached on marriage, which seems a little bit of an anomaly, as his own marriage was a total disaster. He had several warm relationships with ladies through his life. Some of the letters, some of the remarks he makes in his diary are still with us today. So interesting they are, so revealing of his tenderness, something that Wesley is commonly attributed as being a very hard man. Indeed, he was on himself. But it is quite easy to see in reading his journal that he was a warm, friendly man, loving company, and really given to close
friendships.
Wesley enjoyed incredibly good health all the way through his life. There were only on certain occasions when he was, as he often put it, indisposed or ill. On two of these occasions, there were repercussions that had a very profound effect on the Methodist movement, or on John Wesley at least, in particular. The first one was in 1748 when he arrived in Newcastle. The journal merely says that he was indisposed, and there's no explanation given as to what the indisposition was. There was a lady looking after the meeting house in Newcastle whose name was Grace Murray. She was a widow. She was a Christian lady of a very vital Christian experience, a born-again woman. When Wesley was there, he was nursed very well by this lady, and he saw in her qualities that would befit a wife of the leader of the Methodist movement.
Women's Company, and he was often writing to my dear sister and getting their support and help. And it was really this liking for Women's Company that led to his disastrous love life. He wanted to marry Sophie Hopkins in the States, and that hadn't come off. And now he wanted to marry Grace Murray, you know, don't you, who was in charge of the orphan house at Newcastle upon Tyne, and was a wonderful woman. She'd have made him a wonderful wife. But on the other hand, perhaps it wasn't God's will he should be married, because if he'd been too happily married, he might have ceased to be married to the Methodist Societies, if you follow me. But he wants to marry Grace Murray.
Now, John and Charles had promised each other that neither would marry without informing the other. And when Charles heard this small, plumpish, semi-retired Methodist minister living in Marylebone absolutely exploded. His anger carried him through the trip up north, where he confronted John. He told John that what he thought he was doing was an absolute atrocity to the cause of Methodism. Wasn't going to help the cause, in fact was going to hinder it. Charles knew that Grace Murray had been erstwhile committed to John Bennett, and it is thought by many that that was Charles's main motivation for intervening here. John gave him a quiet answer and vindicated all the reasons, to himself at least, of why he had chosen to marry Grace. Charles left more angry than ever and rode straight to Grace. He hid his anger at this point and turned on the charm. He explained to Grace what a mistake he thought she was making, and how that John Bennett was just the man for her.
He knew that John was really to be married to a Methodist Society. And so you know what he did, don't you? He got Grace Murray at the very time when John was traveling to the north to marry her. He got her married off to another man. And John was absolutely broken-hearted for a very short period.
Finally, receiving advice from some of his friends that they thought he should marry, coincidences worked together to bring him to marry a lady called Molly Vizales. He was crossing London Bridge one day, it was a snowy day, and he tripped up and sprained his ankle. So he was in bed for several days, and this lady nursed him. She fell madly in love with him and wanted to marry him, and he conceded. However, the relationship here was something of a mismatch. Perhaps it was happening too quickly. Perhaps his commitment to this awakening, to this revival, was too strong for any human being to interfere with. He was married to his church, to his following, to his work, and a lady on the scene really interfered with things. In fact, it would seem that she married him completely with a wrong understanding. 2 or 3 days after they were married, Wesley got on his horse and rode away again to preach on his circuit. And nearly his whole life through these 52 years, he was constantly going over this triangle from London to Bristol to Newcastle to London. And he was doing it regularly, this triangle through Britain, with the slight offshoots of that triangle. Occasionally he went to Ireland. he visited Scotland. His wife was dumbfounded when 2 or 3 days after their marriage, he got on his horse and carried on with his circuit. He comments in his diary that he sees no reason why married life should interfere with a Methodist preacher's lifestyle. He sees no reason why a Methodist preacher should preach one sermon less or win one soul less simply because he was married. And with that he rode off. The relationship really degenerated through the years. Some of the stories, whether they're true or not, is quite unknown yet. They're quite in keeping with the obvious fact that this relationship was a catastrophe. It's said that, for instance, that someone would entered his living room one day and she was dragging John Wesley across the floor, holding him by his hair, asking him for something or other, to stay at home and not to go away and preach. It's said that he opened his letters. She used to steal money. Anyone who visits his home today is that he had in the last 12 years of his life will note that there are secret drawers in his desk there, in his own study. Perhaps that was a result of the experiences he had with his wife.
You know, she just became absolutely crazy, you know, and jealousy, and left him. And he wrote in his journal in Latin, so that Tom, Dick and Harry couldn't understand it, "I did not leave her. I did not dismiss her. I shall not recall her."
Died on a Monday. They didn't tell Wesley until the Friday that his own wife had died. He hadn't seen her for several years at that time, and so probably they thought it would interfere with his ministry. All these emphases that Wesley pressed during the life of this Methodist revival are really surfacing in this generation. For despite this anomaly with his married life, he pressed relationships. He pressed the need of small groups. He pressed the need of family life. And he preached to families. He preached on politics. And again, we have this 20th century parallel. In the 20th century move of God, this house church restorationist, whatever title the listener puts upon this new thing that's happening, there is this emphasis which says instead of the Christians withdrawing from society, as they tend to have done, they should be involved in all levels of society and making their impact felt. And so as he travelled, he preached about politics. He told people how to vote, not necessarily who to vote for, but bringing in the ethical way of thinking to preach for those who they thought would do them the most good, regardless of political party, those who they thought were the most honourable people. And so Wesley impacted society with these insights. One of the basic complaints of the lethargy from the lethargic people in the Anglican ministry at that time was his enthusiasm. And that was the basic grounds of their complaint. Mr. Wesley, they said, is nothing but an enthusiast. And such enthusiasm is very dangerous when it comes to the area of religion. His enthusiasm carried him. He passed that enthusiasm on. But it was a very superficial glance to say that all Wesley was doing was giving enthusiastic addresses. He was enthusiastic about life. He was enthusiastic about living. He was enthusiastic about being generous. He maintained to the day he died this concept of living on as little money as he could, and anything that was surplus he would give away. And his conviction about giving to the poor was so strong. Can you imagine this happening, that in 1781, 4th of January, it was a snowy day in London. I know that because it's in Wesley's diary. He's a world famous man by this time. He's a very noble looking gentleman. He's travelled all around Britain. He has spoken to royalty, he's spoken to the commoner. And there are thousands upon thousands of people in Britain whose lifestyles have been changed because of their contact with Wesley and these things that he was bringing to society. And because he saw one day in the snow such poverty and people who hardly had clothes to cover them, hardly had food to eat, this grand old man at the age of 81, went out onto the streets begging, in the snow, begging for the poor of his area. And every penny he received, he went and gave it to some of these families who lived not so far from him. So he was consistent. His consistency is amazing. His methodical, that's why they were called Methodists, of course, his methodical, systematic approach to life, to his understanding of the Bible, to his answers to people's problems, was a lifelong thing. And the only inconsistency that can ever be labelled at him, if it was indeed his inconsistency, was this relationship with his wife. Another one of these radical things that Wesley introduced, it was really his lifestyle. It wasn't that he consciously introduced it, was his manner of preaching. The caricature of Christian preachers, which are so-called hellfire and damnation, laying everybody low as terrible and wicked sinners, is what is said by many, is what is needed. If we want Christianity to be restored to where it should be in Western society, this is the sort of emphasis we should make. And yet Wesley, surely the greatest revivalist that the whole world has ever seen, spoke against such approaches. In fact, in his diary and his travels, wherever he saw the Methodist classes diminishing, going down in number, or even closing, he would inquire as to why it had happened. And many times he notes in his journal that it was where those who were preaching were always highlighting the faults and the failures to a great emphasis of the people they were talking to, laying them low, making them feel inferior. He said that Jesus came to lift people high, to make them feel better, to set them free from all these things, and to harp on and on and on about the wickedness of the evils of that society. Those evils were undoubtedly put right as people realized what it was that God could do for them as they came to this same relationship with God as that Wesley himself was experiencing. This isn't to say, of course, that everything that Wesley said and did was consistent with modern Christian thought. There is, for instance, the story of the Christian school at Kingswood in Bristol. I'd read Wesley's journals many times over and wondered just what it was that he was always complaining the staff would not fulfill the rules, the commands that he'd set down for the running of the school. And as time progressed, I'd developed quite some bad thoughts against this staff, whoever they were. Surely Mr. Wesley's rules weren't so outrageous. Until recently at the Wesley Museum in London, I read a tract prepared by John Wesley himself to do with Christian education. And some of his remarks are really quite outstanding. For instance, he says quite plainly that as he esteemed the rising at 4 o'clock one of the major contributions to his good health, he saw no reason why the children shouldn't do the same. So it was part of the curriculum, part of the rules at Kingswood, that children should rise at 4 in the morning, meditate on scripture till 5 o'clock, this is all before breakfast, and then do a couple of hours work in the garden or in the fields before coming home for breakfast at 9. There is also the remarkable statement from Wesley's own hand that says the little boy that learns to play grows up to be the man that learns to play. And for that reason, playtime was completely out of the curriculum at the Wesleyan school at Kingswood in Bristol. So in actual fact, it's no wonder he had such trouble with his staff. So with the impact of his preaching, with the delegation of leadership responsibilities, spreading around the country, daily preaching to thousands upon thousands of people, the Wesleyan Revolution took a hold of Britain, and Britain started to change.
good. And many of us in this room have discovered that we have experience in the Lord's Word. Far more blessings than we ever dreamed of.
What do the average Englishman know about John Wesley? Maybe they pass this way every day without knowing that one of the world's most revolutionary men got converted right here. Or the regular church visitor, does he or she know that one of the world's most significant Christian leaders, John Wesley, saved the country from a revolution similar to the one that took place in France in 1789? What do tourists know about him? I'm sure that most of them visit St. Paul's Cathedral, the church where Wesley himself attended in his pre-conversion days. After 52 incredibly busy years, he maintained his health and his strength throughout his entire campaign. There were various bouts of illness and sickness, but they lasted only very briefly. At the age of 85, he remarks in his diary how he felt stronger then than he did in his 50th year. In this, our last programme in a series of 4, Keith Lanham presents The End Years, The Tide Turns.
It was a very necessary thing to consider in those days, for without the aid of PA systems, without the aid of auditoriums that were made especially for meetings of that ilk, these preachers, Wesley and his entire Methodist band of preachers, entire circuit of preachers around the nation, were preaching to thousands upon thousands of people. And these meetings were held in some in natural amphitheatres where the local lay of the land would give itself to some sort of carrying of sound. But it was a great toll, number one, on the throat, on the frame, as they threw all their energies into preaching for sometimes 2 or 3 hours. That's another thing of the 20th century. In most churches around the country, when people stand up to preach for 20 minutes, half an hour, people tend to look at their watch and tip their watch as if to say, well, you know, we've had enough for this week. But in Wesley's day, a 2-hour address was absolutely the norm. And when, for instance, preaching to the largest crowd that I've seen noted in his diaries was round about his 75th year, I believe. He was up in Newcastle upon Tyne, right up in the north of England, and he claims that he was preaching to 32,000 people. And those on the very outskirts of this crowd could hear him clearly. And the thought, the picture of a 75-year-old man preaching and shouting things at a volume that 32,000 people could hear without a microphone, and without any advanced publicity for the 32,000 to attend, is quite an amazing one. His best friend, George Whitefield, whether or not it was his best friend, he seems to have a particular affection for the man, died early, and it seems to me, in all my recollections, the studies, the accounts that I've heard, that what really killed Whitefield was his incredible effort into these public addresses. For although rightly so, Wesley didn't make the preaching the foremost centre and crux of all his Christian experience, and the way the Methodists ran their whole setup, nevertheless it was a vital part, and this preaching to so many for so long, so often, took its toll on the health of the speakers. So at the age of 85, Wesley was consistently being asked what was the secrets of his good health. For he was in ever such fine shape, and
said in his journals while he was 85 that he'd never felt so fit since his 50th birthday. In answer to this question, he gave a standard 3 answers. First of all, answer number 1 was that he rose 4 o'clock every morning, ever since the age of 25 or 26, with 1 or 2 breaks for short illnesses. He was up at 4 o'clock every morning. He constantly affirmed that going to bed at 10 and rising at 4 was one of the secrets of his very strong constitution. Secret number 2 was that he used to preach every morning at 5 o'clock, regardless of where he was. When he was in London, it would be at his headquarters, which for many years was at a place called the Foundry, later on at the chapel which is now referred to as Wesley's Chapel. But even when he was out on circuit, he would just look for a crowd, and once there were 2 or 3 people, he would commence preaching and go on for an hour or 2, and would always finish up with thousands needing this great bellowing voice, which would of course exercise the diaphragm and the lungs. Secret number 3 was his travelling. All through his youth he travelled the nation on horseback, and later on he travelled in stagecoaches provided by the wealthy Methodists who'd given their lives to Christ and were totally committed to the Methodist cause. And so at 85, this was what Wesley claimed was the secrets of his very fine and healthy constitution. We have this picture of him riding on horseback, the jogging of the horse, and Wesley reading and writing things that were to change the course of the nation, all done on horseback. The thought of it is quite astonishing. And in later years, of course, as even though he maintained good health, people bought him carriages and horses so that he wouldn't have to traverse on a horse, but he could sit in the comparative comfort of a carriage. Although perhaps it's a little bit out of place to use the word comfort, for in those days the state of the roads was absolutely appalling, and some commentators think that travelling in a carriage in those days would have been much more bumpy, much worse than sitting on horseback, which gives you some indication of what the roads were like. He maintained this wonderful state of health to around about August 1790, when in his journal he begins to remark about his failing health. His first remarks were about his right hand, which began to shake and was affecting his writing. He also remarked about his eyesight that was beginning to dim and making it slightly difficult for him to read at certain times of the day. His tiredness began to tell on him when he says, rather remarkable to us, but what was almost a guilty conscience to him, was that at one point, round about September 1790, he could only manage a 2-hour address, raising his voice to 10,000 people. Such had been the intense earnestness with which Wesley had slaved for the previous 52 years in order to bring this revolution to Britain. He was highly successful. He lived and preached during the reign of the 3 King Georges, and this was a time of great upheaval for Britain. George I, for instance, knew hardly any English at all, and there was a great upheaval in the nation as to who was the rightful heir to the throne. But in the midst of these years, when there was lack of character, there was lethargy, there was total lack of integrity throughout the population of Britain, Wesley brought back backbone, character, integrity, almost single-handed. His influence affected so many thousands of people that it is said the nation was saved from a revolution similar to that which was taking place as Wesley wrote those words in August 1790, a revolution that was beginning in Paris. Very similar to the present-day awakening which is happening within the church and touching different classes and beginning to touch political circles, was this constant cry of people within the Methodist movement calling for Wesley to leave the Church of England.
which is just what is happening today in this so-called restoration movement, house church, however you wish to refer to it, where people are constantly crying, come out, leave these denominations, leave these movements where you already are, and join this new thing. And Wesley fought against it all his life. It's very difficult to conceive in this 20th century that at that time, basically, there was, with one or two exceptions, there was basically just the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church, never referred to as a church in these historical manuscripts and diaries and writings, always referred to very harshly as popery. But what happened was that these people within the Methodist movement were part of the Church of England setup. It is not commonly known or acknowledged, but John Wesley was a Church of England minister till the day he died. And at various Methodist conferences that they used to have every year around about July or August, he would push this, that we are part of the church. We are not here to cause a split. We are not here to cause a fraction from the Orthodox Church of England. We are Methodists, and what we are doing is bringing life to the present setup as it is. We are bringing life to the nation, and there may be people, bishops, archbishops within the context of the Church of England that don't approve of us, but we are Church of England, and that is how we'll stay. And constantly, it got quite heated near the end of his life, he had these men around him who were pleading with him at times to leave the Church of England and become the Methodist Church. Charles was always against such things very strongly. And although we have this anomaly, this is the innovations that we refer to in another program that John Wesley was always into, although he insisted that they would never leave the Church of England as long as he was alive, nevertheless, he had these innovations in Methodist halls. For instance, he would introduce a communion table, which to most nonconformists is absolute irrelevance. But in the context of the Church of England, it was only there that communion could be served. And so to have a communion table in a Methodist meeting hall had inferences which suggested that they were becoming their own church. John constantly upset his brother with this sort of behavior. He was innovating things all the time which suggested to Charles that he might be going a little bit over the top and becoming his own movement, his own church. But John was very strong on this till the end. What brought the secession from the Church of England, which, by the way, happened after his death, was a very strong feeling that came to Wesley when he wanted to send some of his men out to preach in Georgia and in the United States as it now is. For to go over there, they had to be able to serve communion to the members of the Methodist movement. By this time, there was 60,000 Methodists in America that was built. They were sent out from Wesley. They were part of the Wesleyan movement. And unless they were ordained, they couldn't give the bread or the wine to the communicants. The ordination, so-called, of Coke.
That was breaking the rules. Well, you see, the Church of England wouldn't have anything to do with the United States of America because they'd been rebels against the head of the church. The head of the church legally is still Her Majesty the Queen, you know, don't you? The head of the Anglican Church is the monarch. And so that the Anglicans wouldn't touch these rebels with the new republic. And there again, Wesley didn't share that view at all. And as the Church of England wouldn't send any ministers over there, he appointed his own bishop to fill the gap, if you follow me. Wesley always just got on with the job regardless of the rules. Is that a naughty thing to say? But I think there's some truth in it.
So he laid hands on Coke.
Yes.
Which had profound repercussions after his death.
Yes, Coke was to be the superintendent of the church. That's a term we use for senior ministers. And Coke ordained Asbury, who was over there, hadn't come back home like most of the loyalists. And then he was ordained as superintendent. See, the Church of England wouldn't touch America for obvious reasons. They were rebels. And Methodism carried on with the job, which is why we're a very strong and powerful church in the States. It's historically understandable.
The implications and the repercussions of this action were not felt until after Wesley died. And it was after he died that, because of that action, they said, well, we're virtually separate from the Church of England anyhow, so let's go the whole way. And thus, very simplistically put, that's how the Methodist Church came into being.
It's funny, I met some people I was visiting the other day from South Africa, and the boy's name was Nelson. That was after Admiral Lord Nelson. I said, oh, I'm sorry about that. It ought to be after John Nelson, one of the first Methodist lay preachers. John Nelson was a pacifist, and so they conscripted him, press ganged him into the army, you see, to shut him up. And he said, I cannot bow my knee to pray for a man and then get up and kill him when I've done. And Wesley sympathized with him, came to the rescue, and got him out of the army. And he was one of our first and most powerful lay preachers.
It was no slow and steady fade out for the great man, John Wesley. He was active even until his last year, and when suddenly from preaching round about, he went abroad as far as Winchelsea down on the south coast. He preached indoors for his last time, returned home, and then suddenly began to feel quite weak. He went to bed, and for the last few days of his life, he was occasionally slightly delirious, singing some of his brother's favourite hymns, favourite to John Wesley that was, and was quoted as saying several times in his almost delirium as he was fading away, the best thing of all is that God is with us. He drank tea. There was a scene round his bedside where many of his old friends who were still alive came to bid him farewell. He acknowledged he was about to die. His friends knew it. Charles Wesley's wife came to see him. Charles had died several years earlier. And there he was. The scene is graphically given to us by an engraving which at this point of time hangs on above the very spot where his bed was in his house for the last 12 years. He lived in the house known as Wesley's house. Now it's 47 City Road in London, and the bedroom is almost preserved as it was in Wesley's time. And over the scene where he died, he spent his last moments, there is this painting, engraving, black and white, picture of a crowd around his bed as John Wesley went to meet his God. His eyes almost alight as if he had some divine vision as he passed away. The impact had been made. He was world famous. His doctrines, though he is not credited so much as being a theologian, for the simple reason that he always saw Christianity as something to be presented to the people, not to be systematically worked out in some sort of theology book. I really believe that is the reason why John Wesley didn't write a systematic theology as did men like Charles Finney and John Calvin. Even George Whitefield used to push his Calvinistic theology all his life. Wesley used to keep this middle line where his main zeal was to win people to God, was to change people's lives, not necessarily to convince them that his particular brand of theology was correct. But that does not infer that he didn't have a theology, nor does it infer that his theology wasn't well thought out. It's being pieced together. There's been over 200 biographies of John Wesley written. There are numerous copies of his journal, edited and abridged here and there. so that they read different things to different people. The books written about him are so numerous that it is a true indication of what this man did for the society in which he lived, and indeed the society in which we now live. He was in many ways a man ahead of his time.
The ordinary people knew that he loved them. He didn't just boss them or what's the word I want, try to make them behave themselves. He loved them, and they knew that. So they came in their thousands to his burial.
This is it. It's almost a shrine today. But within these four walls, John Wesley, after 87 revolutionary years, passed away. At that time, a bed, this isn't the bed, but something very similar was where the chest of drawers is now. And over the site where the bed was is a very dramatic and very famous picture of his death. This is where it happened. In his youth, he was despised and rejected, refused preaching opportunities in churches and in parishes around the country. And yet, when he was in his 70s, he marks down, he wrote very clearly and said, "The tide is turning." For years he'd been pushed out, nobody wanted him, he was called an enthusiast. But when the impact and the full effect of the Methodist movement was seen as a whole, as old age crept upon him, he began to be looked upon as a grand old Christian man, and was loved and respected and invited everywhere he went.
Wesley's upbringing, just for a moment or two, made him uneasy about it, you see. And it was his mother who, thank God, came to the rescue and saved him from going down the wrong road. And she said, "Why are you making such a fuss? He's as much called by God to preach as any parson is." Which is, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it shows how, to begin with, Wesley still had some of the old Anglican arrogance about him. And it was Susanna who, in a way, gave her blessing to lay preaching. She's buried, you know, she died at the Foundry. And he looked after her in her old age, and she's buried in Bunhill Field. You know that, don't you? Just across the road. And that's very appropriate. I wrote to a former Dean of St. Paul's and said, "I'm glad that Wesley's Chapel is opposite Bunhill Fields, because Bunhill Fields is the burial place of the nonconformists." And Wesley was radically nonconformist, not in the ecclesiastical sense, but in the fundamental religious sense. Be not conformed to this world, that's Wesley, but transformed. That's his doctrine of holiness.
There's a lovely story told how Charles Wesley Jr., this is Charles Wesley's son, got together a very nicely bound volume of his father's hymns, of which staggering 6,000 songs did Charles Wesley write. His best ones were put in this book. It was very attractively bound, and Charles Wesley Jr. Took it to the King, His Majesty King George III. And as he entered, so the story goes, King George asked that all his attendants would leave while he had a chat with Charles Wesley Jr. And he said, "Mr. Wesley, I want to say, quite unashamedly, although he wasn't bold enough to say it in front of those people that stood around him, that your father, Charles Wesley, your uncle, John Wesley, George Whitfield and Lady Huntingdon have done more to benefit my people in this century than anybody else in this great nation of ours." And that was the remark made by royalty about a man, John Wesley, and this revolution which he had imparted very successfully to the nation.
In a way, St. Paul stands for everything that rejected Wesley, unfortunately. It's different now, thank God. But in a way, somebody said to me, "Where would you have had the service if you'd had to arrange it?" "There isn't room in Wesley's chapel." "No, there isn't. I should have had it in Hyde Park." "Why not?" He preached in the open air. That's where his biggest congregations were. But it might rain. Well, I said you'd have to have special prayer meetings all over the church, asking God to send us good weather. Forgive me jesting like this, but in a sense I meant it. Wesley lived in 2 rooms: his sitting room, his study rather, and his bedroom, and the little room where he said his prayers every morning. That takes you, I think, to the real heart of the man.
4 o'clock every morning for the last 12 years of Wesley's life, while he lived in this building, he would arise from his bed and come through to this little room which comes off his bedroom. He would kneel. The wood is the same kneeler if the material upon it isn't. At this low boy, light the candle. He would pray and read his Bible. He said in his journal every morning he is alone with God. He reads his word, and what he reads, he teaches. The way Wesley is often looked at through rose-tinted glasses, and people interpret what they want. They get their favourite aspects of Christianity and they say, well, preaching, this is what we want. Songwriting, this is what we want. And yet really deep down at the grassroots level, John Wesley was a total revolutionary. His approach to Christianity leaves a statement that is still to be understood today and still to be put into practice today. That his understanding of God and Christianity was not so that we become, quotes, religious and church attenders, but that it affects us in our homes, in our lives, in our relationships, with our jobs. It benefits people, it uplifts people, frees their conscience, brings health and wholeness and concern and care to every aspect of life. He preached it, he pushed it, and thus was this revolution brought to Britain. And so if you ever pick up this volume that mentions about the 10 greatest revolutions that the world has experienced, you too can check up that 5th chapter, which talks about the Wesleyan Revolution, and where it clearly says that the Wesleyan Revolution, the Methodist Revolution in England in the 1700s, was without doubt the best organised, the most deep set and society-changing revolution on a long-term basis that the world has ever seen. May God raise up another John Wesley on similar lines.